Make much sense.
Very good. So we are going to continue the discussion with Gustavo next.
I will read Gustavo's sentences for him that he just sent me. So he says he wants to add that so the crimes that created the structures of sin that are the roots of inequality and poverty have accomplices in institutional politics. I don't know if you know, but in many countries, in many developing countries, the funding of political campaigns, of electoral campaigns is a mystery because the rules for funding political parties are completely ridiculous and gray, and they have big gray areas. So this is an invitation to the parties to find funding through corruption or organized crime, and this conditions the politicians who are then elected to the government. And even if they have good intentions, they're still conditioned by the original sin of their funding. And this explains why there are not that many politicians in the institutions who are brave enough when it comes to discussing seriously the redistribution of wealth, and who inevitably have to find someone else to put pressure to push forward the issues that they care about. And they have to find this in interreligious leaders and in young people or in social and movements or trade unions. So democracy in many countries of Latin America has, so he repeats, so the funding rules of the political parties in many countries in Latin America are deliberately obscure and invite to corruption. So Gustavo also says that he would like the declaration, the statement, the final statement to include an appeal to make the system, the funding system, more transparent for electoral campaigns in order to allow the effective participation of citizenship. Otherwise, there will never be honesty and courage in politics.
Thank you. Please, Rocco.
Only to enlarge what Gustavo has said. It is not only the problem of money, the money to keep a party running. It is also the problem of access to information. You cannot make a political campaign if you do not have access to information. There is no equal right of access to information in many countries, in most countries. And this is one of the reasons why politics is so corrupted. The masters, those who are in power, those who have good relations to the owners of the great media, have access to the media. Those who do not, well, they must make politics only through a one-to-one relation going from one home to another home. Of course, this makes change extremely difficult.
Please, Katrina.
I would like to come back to the question about inequality, because for a utilitarian, inequality is not bad in itself, of course, right? It's only bad as so far as it brings bad consequences. That's, for example, suffering, yes? The same with justice. And of course, it doesn't mean that we utilitarians don't see clear connections between justice, injustice, and inequality, and the problem of the poor and suffering. But I do worry, I wonder as a philosopher, if we can imagine a world in which no one is poor, everyone has what brings them pleasure or fulfills their desires, whatever we choose. But the world is unequal still, yes. So there is a big discrepancy between the rich and those who are not so very rich. Would it be a bad world?
Logically, it would be.
But why?
Because well-being.
Much closer.
Sorry, because well-being comes from, from relative deprivation. So psychologically, I think it's not a reality that you can see that other people have much more than you and have many more opportunities, and that you would still feel okay. You always measure by the standards of the society. And that is, I think, one of your, I can't remember what it was called, but that's one of the reasons there is a poverty measure within your society, because it means you're not included.
Relative
And
poverty.
not being included and not getting along is one of the reasons of, I mean, you could say, you could bring it back to suffering. You could say that's one of the reasons to suffer. But so it's unimaginable psychologically, I would say.
But then let's make it a bit utilitarian still. So I'm fine. Yes, I mean I have everything that I need really. Of course, I could have more. You know, I could have my own plane and I could have my own boat and a huge house and so on. But would you think good of me if I wanted all of those things because someone else's have them? Yes, so that's what worries me, yes, that the world would be still imaginable, but what would it be on my side if I wanted more only because the other has it? Yes, wouldn't be something wrong with me. I mean, I should be fine with what I have. I'm not a very rich person, but I have all the basic needs, I'm sure. Yes, much more than most of the people. So
I think that part of the struggle is not that everybody would want a plane, but everybody ought to have health care. Everybody ought to have a living wage. Everybody ought to have decent housing. Everybody ought to be free of voter suppression. Everybody ought to have equal protection under the law. Everybody ought to have a country where if somebody swears to promote the general welfare, they don't go in and promote the general corporations. I think the issue of inequality is that more so than wondering if we can imagine a world where no one is poor at all, can we imagine a world that's not settled with that does not accept the reality of poverty and low wealth as a natural order? Whether or not I have a plane or don't have a plane, there are some people that don't mind having, they don't want a plane, but if they would like a decent house, a decent car, they would like to have opportunity for education. And what we know is the systems have actually undermined it. I was sitting here thinking, I'm going to make a strange argument. I guess most people sit here and say he's Black. Well, I am. I'm white. I'm Black. I'm Native. But one of the things I get concerned about, even when we do economics, is when we talk about poor, often, even unintentionally, we go to race. We think poor and we think Black. And I think that's problematic because we need to disaggregate poverty more and show how it's impacting all people. Now, maybe like for instance, in America, Jeffrey, correct me if I'm wrong, if you look at the supplemental measurement, you got 140 million poor and low wealth people in America, poor and low wealth. Now, 60.9% of Black people are poor and low wealth, 30-some% of white people are poor and low wealth. But if you flip that over, disaggregate that number, that's 66 million white people and 26 million Black people. So you got 40 million more white people in terms of raw number. Now I know some of my white brothers and sisters, but we don't want to talk about that because people won't focus on the discrimination. Listen, we need you to focus on that because what we need is to make the country see the depth of the problem and how it impacts all communities. As we got to make sure we include Appalachia in America, just like we include Alabama. Now, why? Because they were deliberately split. In our country, one of the most diabolical schemes that was done by the Southern aristocracy was they decided on a philosophy in the 1960s called the Southern Strategy. And a part of it said, we are going to deliberately split Black and white people, especially poor people, from each other. Lastly, in 1965, Dr. King said at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, he said the great fear of the Southern aristocracy was the Negro and white masses of poor and lower people coming together and forming a political bloc that could change the economic architecture of the country. That was attacked deliberately. The division was for economic reasons, not just for Black, I don't want to sit beside someone who happened to be white. It was a deliberate design to keep Black and white people out of the same space, because when Black former slaves and freedmen and poor white folk came together after slavery, they started seeing themselves as allies, and it was too powerful. And so one of the things around the world, I hope, and I want to add this conversation, is that we disaggregate every time we talk. My daddy was from Camden, right? But I also am from Eastern North Carolina that has a lot of poor white people as well, who are also my blood cousins, right? My blood cousins. My grandfather, lastly, was in the Blair Mountain Wars. The Blair Mountain Wars was when miners in West Virginia stood up against the bosses, and they were Black and white miners. My granddad was a Black coal miner who stood right beside white coal miners who were bombed from the air by biplanes, by the government, simply because they wanted voting rights and they wanted wages. So one of the things I think in the conversation about poverty, and I have to be careful not to make it, is that yes, we need to look at the race side, but we also have to fight a demon that is existing in this world. And that is that we say poverty and we say race. And we think, people think poor, they think you're just talking about Black people.
I need to challenge that because
Okay.
I'm a citizen of the United States, I'm a citizen of France, and I'm a citizen of Togo. I was saying that earlier. And so I'm one of those Black people who've been all over the world. And every part of the world that I've been to, Black people at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Sure.
Whether it's Brazil, whether it's Trinidad,
Yeah.
whether it's South Africa, whether it's France where I grew up, whether it's London where I lived for 10 years.
Mhm.
It is a reality that
Exactly.
people will tend to look at poverty with a racial lens because we are very much at the bottom of the totem pole,
We agree.
economically speaking.
We agree.
And so I find it very difficult to disaggregate that, because in people's perception, what they see is Black equals poverty.
Sure, I'm not saying don't ignore race. I'm saying you got to deal with race. Just don't only deal with race, because what you begin to show is that this evil of poverty, if it's targeted at race, it's going to have collateral damage everywhere else. That racism has collateral damage on the other poor folks. So I'm not saying deny it. I'm saying go right at it. Just don't leave out the others.
Please,
If I can just get back to what.
microphone, everybody.
What Katerina was raising, the question of inequality per se,
Yes.
and maybe a theological bent on that. So it's something interesting on that I found that Larry Temkin, who makes an argument about inequality exactly along those lines, trying to argue for the problem of inequality per se, that makes the world less good, brings an example which I think disproves his argument and makes it theological. He says, imagine you're walking down the road and you had two daughters and you're father of two daughters. Notice how this is very gendered, not my example. And there were $200 bills always float towards one, and the other one just didn't happen to get them, right? Wouldn't you want, if you saw a $200 bill, it to float in the other direction? And that's his argument why inequality is a bad thing per se. And I think that example exactly proves that our intuitions against inequality are because there's a fundamental idea of a father of all of us, and that we all come from one source, and all human beings are somehow cousins and brothers and sisters and such. And that is where our tendency to believe in, at least I like to assume that that's what's going on. And he's disproven his argument with his argument. He's just shown that it's really a theological bias, which I happen to admire, but I think should be on the table, at least.
Let me put a little bit of data on the table by looking at inequalities in the high income countries, just for a moment, to talk about how things actually work. It's quite remarkable how similar the pre-tax income distributions are across the high income world, comparing Scandinavia and the United States, for example, not a lot of difference. Where the differences of inequality show up are in the following. First, when you look at the distribution of income or wealth, there really are two parts of the income distribution. There is a super wealthy part, and then there is the normal humanity part. And they're quite different in statistical relations. One is called a power law, and the other is an exponential distribution. And what it means is the following. The power law is what you get when the rich get richer. When you have wealth at the very top, it grows at a proportionate rate. And if it's not controlled, it just continues to grow at a very large rate through inheritance and through making mega fortunes. The United States has a higher part of that than Europe, partly because Europe's great wealth was destroyed in two wars in a way that was not true in the United States also. The rest of the income distribution is called an exponential curve. It actually turns out it's almost like the distribution of velocities of molecules in the atmosphere. It follows what's called Boltzmann's law. It's a kind of random distribution. And there's a good reason to believe that the income distribution in our kind of society has that kind of randomness to it. Mm-hmm. But it is subject to public policy change. So where Europe is quite different is that there is a high base. Everybody has, there is no poor in Northern Europe. It's excluded by the socialization of health, education, infrastructure, and family transfers, so that there is not relative poverty, but pre-tax, it looks very similar. What Europe does that the United States does not do is redistribute a significant proportion of this randomized national income to make sure that the bottom is at a quite significant, stable, responsible level where everybody has the whole list that Reverend Barber has, because everybody does have that list essentially. So this is where an open society is going to have randomness. The equilibrium normally in any random assortment with energy in it, where there's a positive temperature, whether it's air molecules or people earning income, turns out to be something like an exponential curve, a Boltzmann distribution. And incomes are no different from gas molecules in this, strangely enough. It reflects a certain kind of randomness. Some are lucky, some are not. People bounce off each other. Somebody's income doubles, the other income halves. But what you can do about it is a lot. You can make a floor, for example, that is quite robust, and that floor can be higher and higher. And at the top, you can also have your limitarian policies. So you don't have to accept as many billionaires as happen to break free of the Boltzmann distribution and get into this power law distribution. You can say, no, there are inheritance laws. Your wealth is broken up across generations. That's an extremely powerful way to do things. Even if you have super wealthy, if they can't leave it to anybody, you end up basically preventing the accumulation of large landed aristocracies in the 21st century. And this, I think, shows that we should expect some inequality. We should learn, I think, also to have the kind of moderation of views that Katerina is talking about, which is that is a cultivation of views and of ethics, which is, I'm comfortable. This is a nice life. I don't have to compare myself with Jeffrey Bezos. You know, it's interesting, weird. He's got $200 billion. Okay, I don't want him to have 200 billion, but I don't need 200 billion. That's not my interest at all. So I think that this is there's partly it's living with inequality that is moderate because it does reflect to an extent an open society. Living with people suffering, unacceptable. Why should anyone suffer? There's so much wealth around. Nobody should be deprived of what they need. That is horrendous. Cultivating a sense of moderation is probably a good Stoic principle that is, you know, has been preached for 2,300 years from Zeno onward, and from Aristotle onward. Moderation in all things, magnanimity, liberality, and so forth. These are good virtues to have. So we don't need to compress the income distribution. More than that, if everyone is leading a decent life. So I'm with you on that. I don't like the part at the super top because they happen to own the American political system right now. And I rather resent that. I want my vote, but I don't have a vote right now. The American people don't have a vote. 70% want taxes on the rich. And what does Congress say? Well, I don't know. It's very complicated. They pay for my campaign. So this is where things are broken at the top, and things are broken at the bottom because we don't respect humanity. We don't respect the human dignity at the bottom and understand how easy it is to ensure that higher floor. There's nothing natural about people suffering. And that, I think, is where the attention is most crucially needed.
Okay.
Who is?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Hi. Yeah,
Hi, how are you?
This is a philosophical point, but I hope it will be of general interest. One of the ways of thinking about utilitarianism, certainly this is Mill's way, is to begin, and this is in an ecumenical spirit, to begin with the sources of intrinsic motivation in people. And there's a lot of evidence that people are intrinsically motivated for things like respect, certain types of relationships, certain kinds of autonomy. And so if one gets a theory of intrinsic good from looking at intrinsic motivation, and Mill did this, you'll say that the elements of happiness are not just material or even subjective. They include things like relationships, respect, and autonomy. And so it's perfectly compatible with the utilitarian view to say, you will get a better society by increasing these goods. And I think that was part of the focus of the earlier discussion, because these are structural goods that make for relationships among people that are of the kind that they are most concerned to have. And so it's quite right, it seems to me, that there's going to be some random inequality, and that's perhaps in economic terms tolerable. But what is intolerable, pick up on the point just made, is for these basic goods to be denied. And that's what inequality is about. It's about relations among people that deny some dignity, that deny some autonomy, that deny some capacity to act and get the respect of others.
Yes, please. You're next.
Again, oh, yes. I wanted to zoom up the perspective. That is, we have been talking about sedentary societies, but why don't we talk about migration? So I learned from Romano Prodi, but after he was the president of the European Commission, he was involved in Africa. And he taught us there is no such thing as Europe and Africa. There is one thing that begins in Norway and ends in South Africa. And what happens now with sub-Saharan countries, Togo, is what will happen in the 21st century. So my exhortation to you is why don't we start considering the issue of mobility and acceptance of migrations, blessed who are the persecuted, in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. This is something we have to fix sooner or later, I think.
Very good. Rocco.
Well, thank you. I think we cannot consider the problem of income distribution without introducing the concept of merit. And I think Marshall several years ago, has given us an interesting explanation on these issues. He says, first, we have not a right to fulfill all our desires, but we have all a right to fulfill our fundamental needs. So everybody should have the fundamental needs covered: food, health, and so forth. Then he introduces a second distinction, and this regards what he calls citizenship goods. There are some goods that do not correspond really to fundamental needs, but correspond to what is needed in a certain society to consider yourself as a member of that society. He calls them citizenship goods. And in that society, everyone has a right to have these citizenship goods that corresponds also to the possibility of improving your own condition. One of the citizenship goods is the right to improve your condition through your work. And here enters the issue of merit. Beyond that limit, the inequality of income is justified, should be justified through merit. Although very often we have inequality of income that is not based on merit. This opens only a completely different realm in which we should meditate, how much they can be justified and how they can be reduced. Then you have the political problem that we find already in the laws of Plato. If one is too rich, he is a danger for the democracy. He has too much power. Beyond a certain limit, money is not the possibility of fulfilling material needs. It is just a means to exercise power. And beyond a certain limit, there is incompatible with democracy. And I think that in our societies, well, I prudently say we are very close to that limit, but sometimes I doubt we are already beyond that limit. And so I think we need a differentiated analysis that considers all these different levels. And perhaps we need another encounter just to talk about inequality that is connected with poverty, but not exactly the same.
Why do you say we're close to the limit, but not necessarily over the limit?
Because I am an optimist.
Can I ask a question? I was trying to hear the piece about merit and the piece about desire. Just as a question, I'm always struck why when poor and low wealth people start desiring, somebody says to them they can't have all they desire, but wealthy people seem to be able to have no restraints on that desire, even if their desire destroys the rest of us, just as a point. And then, you know, I appreciate like Aristotle and Plato, but you know, one time Aristotle called the poor the dregs of the city. I mean, Cicero called the poor the dregs of the city, and looked at people based on a very, in categories, right? Which is why Jesus was so, I mean, I don't think we get sometimes how radical it is that the first people that Jesus puts at the forefront of God's attention, that from the philosophy of God, are the Potokos. The 2 or 3 other words he could have chosen for poor. Greek could have been interpreted for poor, but that word, those who have been made poor. And, you know, we were talking earlier today about the rights. I said to Dr. Sachs one day, you know, there's this great philosopher named Isaiah. He was so good that he died, and his students still wrote 2 more sections in his name, 2nd Isaiah and 3rd Isaiah, but he was dead. But he said in Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the rights of the poor and make women and children pray, not P-R-A-Y, P-R-E-Y. And then he suggests that when you do that, there's another piece of why we have to address this. It's not just to be altruistic and because we love folk, but he goes on to say what will happen to a nation that does that, that ultimately that nation will implode. Whenever it makes the poor, it robs the rights That's why I was fascinated by that conversation, Jeff. I wish we had time to really dig in that, you know, from a biblical standpoint or philosophical, what really are the rights? Scripture says they have rights. The poor have rights. And it says any legislation, any statute that robs, and a robber is worse than a thief. Because a thief would sneak around and hit, but a robber just comes right in your face. And what happens when society is literally robbing folk right in their face and then turning them from human beings into prey, into prey. I mean, and then who's feeding on that prey? Because that's the only reason something is a prey. It is to be fed upon. I think that's the critique we got to wrestle with. What are the rights and how are statutes diminishing people's imago Dei from them being made in the image of God persons to prey, turning people from persons into prey is a great question I think that we face and we have to challenge.
Please.
So on this question of merit, I believe in merit. I have students, some of them get A's, some of them get B's, and some of them get other grades. But when I look at Bill Gates, does he have $500 billion of merit more than me? We're the same age, and in some ways we're similar. Interesting computers at that age. He went on to do Microsoft. The $500 billion came from essentially exploitation of a monopoly that he established and was allowed to continue to establish by a federal government that was asleep at the wheel when it came to computing. So, Bill Gates, yes, he had merit, not that much. And the second thing is that Bill Gates's merit was only relevant because he lived in a society where he could do what he did. If he'd been born in Somalia, he would not have lived to adulthood. Right. So again, merit is within a context of an economic system and political rights and so forth. And so should he get 500 billion? No. And another part of this is that the Bezoses and the Waltons and so forth, right now, their wealth is coming from the fact that all of the taxpayers in the United States are paying for food stamps for their workers. So the middle class is essentially subsidizing the profits of those. So there is definitely yes, there's a need for merit. And when it's rewarded, the benefits do flow to us. But I'll tell you one thing. What would you miss first if nobody wrote any more iPhone apps? Like it just stopped, or if people stopped collecting garbage, right? At some point, you would know the garbage would be a bigger problem, right? So we have to think about what we mean by merit. And how it's connected to the society.
Anita.
I mean, I appreciate this conversation. I have an issue with merit as well. And your example, while I appreciate it, Bill Gates was a college dropout. He was a white man in America who was able to navigate that. So I think that's where you want to look back at those intersections. I'm struck by conversations of basic needs that sometimes leave out sort of not only the franchise, but deep power shifting and leadership and authority. And I would submit that is a basic need. And yet it sometimes gets sort of thrown by the wayside, maybe implicitly or not in the conversation. So I would suggest a deeper exploration of that. And as we continue the discussion, to Reverend Barber's point, I think the contrast of robbers and thieves is well taken. I think the disrespect is so clear when there's an assumption that people don't know it's happening, as if we're stupid. And when it's coming at you, it's sort of this notion of, I think the negative aspects of a Maslow's hierarchy has been to kind of create two tracks. those that we can use to take care of those with low income, and the rest of us who have opportunity for self-actualization. So it's these kinds of theoretical trends and philosophical tenets of my earlier point about sort of Anglo traditions that really need to be turned on their head a little bit more. So just a couple thoughts there.
Got everybody thinking.
It's also not like self-actualization is so universal.
Yeah, to talk about rights and duties and through a different prism, right? And that's always the risk of the poverty conversation, absent those other pieces. It doesn't mean that people don't need food and hygiene and water, but you can't do it half. Because ultimately then you just recreate the same structures over and over again. So that is always the worry in some of the well-being conversation, is it sort of becomes reductionist in that regard. Yeah.
We just alleviate half of it, we're fine. We did a great thing.
Yeah, as if we don't know, you're just, you've not acknowledged my humanity fully. Yeah.
Please, Marcelo.
In relation with the other things that I think that we have a problem with what could be our anthropological idea of human being. Because if we think that the human being is a product of evolution and is maybe the more delicate arrive to the evolution because it's a matter very sophisticated and we think that not have any real transcendence. In the past, we say the soul that is different from the other animals, and not have and live of the spirit with really could have something, some sense, the fraternity, the friendship, and these are the things that the animals not have really. So, and we propose the theory of the gender, that we can be when one sex, another sex, we can have all the sex. What, especially for the religious leaders, especially for the Christian leaders, what could be our proposal? Our proposal is the same the things that we criticized, that the poor people they become rich and become well, but it is not this the solution. We need to give, this is the sense that we propose, this beatitude of the poor spirit, that is to say, we need to have a dimension that the poverty not to be, not to consider the material things, the goods material and the things that we have, the only things that we can put the end of our life. We need to think about other things. Aristotle say the truth, Plato said the good, we say God, but these are really the problem. What is the anthropology when we say we think that we are human person, but what is the idea that have the sociologists and the other science about the human person today? This is the real question, because in the contrary, we don't know, and we are in the dialectic and have a response in dialectic of the proposal that we criticize. So this is, for me, very important question. And I want to add something, especially for religion. We need to have also a consideration, theological consideration. And we know, I mean, the Christians and the Jews, that we have an original sin, and this original sin have not a theory, but is concretely influence in our life. John Paul II, 8 times in his document say, look, consider that the human being have this problem, and we need the grace. We need something, the love of God. We need something to put order in this tendency that we have, each of one of us need. And for this reason, I think that we need to have a proposal that have a good anthropology and also some foundation in the theology. This is I think in the contrary, we only give an answer that is in dialectic with the problem that we have, but not a real answer of the problem.
Could I, I'm just looking through the Wall Street Journal headline today, because I want to give all of you a touch of reality. So the headline is Democrats' tax plans worry high-income business owners. This is the headline. And what's happening now is the Democrats have proposed a package of social support measures for the poor, calling for tax increases on higher incomes and the rich of about 1% of GDP. It's very modest. Since our GDP is $23 trillion right now, and it will rise to about $32 trillion just on a normal trajectory over the next 10 years, the average GDP for the next, or the cumulative GDP for the next 10 years, that's the total output for the US economy, will be about $280 trillion over 10 years. So when you hear a number like 3 trillion of spending, that's 1% of GDP. That's, okay, but listen to what the Wall Street Journal says. They're talking about this is potentially a disaster, a disaster. And they quote a Mr. Eric Wegner, a partner with Lancaster, Pennsylvania accounting firm. And he says the following, this is the front page. This is the real. Folks earning under $400,000 won't see much, if any, direct tax impact, Mr. Wegner added. Business owners making millions of dollars through their pass-through businesses, on the other hand, quote, need to be on high alert. Okay, this is plutocracy in front of your face. If you're making many millions of dollars, you need to be on high alert. If you're making a measly $400,000 a year, don't worry, it's not about you. But believe me, what the story goes on to say is that, Representative Richard Neal, Democrat of Massachusetts, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, said last week that he was just starting to hear some of these concerns from business owners. There's some unease, that's for sure. We're trying to respond to some of the concerns they've raised, and if they're legitimate, we'd obviously be interested in repairing them. Okay, this is what we're really facing right now.
But
what we're facing is hundreds of millionaires and billionaires who control the Congress. And no matter how bad it is, and no matter how many of Reverend Barber's parishioners are dying because they don't have health care, it's unaffordable, because to pay for it requires taxes, not if you're at poverty 400,000 a year, but a few million, which among friends is, very modest, actually. So
what is the idea of the human being that have these people?
The idea is that the richer you are, the more human you are.
Yeah, because you are not the matter. You are matter.
That is correct.
That is all.
And this is
and you are a product of evolution, more and more. So
this is
we need to control the other.
Exactly what we're facing right now.
And what is the money that they put in the arms today? The other day, the General Secretary said that it's terrible, the situation, and it's the best in this last 40 years. And they are great concern about a possible war. Said the Secretary General of the United Nations. But these are the questions. This is the situation. For this, I think really we have a problem with the peace. If the people only want to have money, this is clear that we have the war. The war normally comes from money. So
96% of the tax returns filed by these business partnerships would not be touched. Fewer than 100,000 would be. And believe me, it will not pass.
But you said it, if 1,000 of them are touched, it's bad. 700 people are dying a day from poverty. It's cool. Bishop, you just said something. And I think, but the problem is even worse than what he's saying. The problem is that the people, Jeff, I think, who are trying to do something are trying to do it without any grace in it, without any mercy in it, without even putting a human face on it. So they got into an argument over numbers rather than humanity. And even the Catholic president, who we love, his handlers, I'm standing here today telling you that his handlers said to us, when we offered to put a face on the issue, when we offered to put poor and low wealth people of faith, others, and saying, this is what these programs of faith, put a human face on it, put the Imago Dei in there. His handlers said, no, we can't do that right now. We can't put those kind of people in front of the president right now because the rest of America may not accept them. So even though he's a professing person, his handlers.
These people don't want religion because religion is some kind of limit.
Exactly.
That is clear. This is the Pope say this. This is the mainstream, and they want to colonize. The Pope says it. So they don't want to. Religion is medieval thing. No, all religions, Christian, Jewish, all religion. No, that is clear. And really, it's a very delicate situation if the people have this mentality.
But we have to want.
But
and we have to
the money to go to the war. What is the money? You know, the English Johnson was take arms and put more money to these new arms to the COVID. So this is the question. In the moment of the crisis of the COVID.
$2 trillion a year for arms.
So, and what do with this? What is the reason? But because if you have arms, it's something you want to use the arms. So this is really a tragic moment because this vision.
Ingrid.
Yeah. I just want to return to your first question about what is the idea of the anthropological idea, and also not just we don't want there to have certain measures towards the rich and then make everybody richer. That's not. I think you're right to point out. So I interpret your question as what is the vision we have for what you actually want to approach, and I think there is a vision of the good life. And that is both has a material component and an immaterial component where social relationships are central. There is a whole literature in contemporary philosophy about the meaning of life that can be part of that. And we have more philosophies that go closer to the issues to do in numbers, like the one that I personally prefer is Amartya Sen's capability approach, because it can incorporate both the material and the immaterial. So then you have a vision of the good life. Not tolerating injustices is part of the good society. And from this, you then work out an idea of what a fair society would be, what a good society would be. And there are now quite a number of people working on this. People like Christian Felber with his economy of the common good, but also the people from the donut economy, the governments that try to implement a well-being economy. I see this as very hopeful signs. From that analysis follows that we must tax more and that we should not tolerate the rich. So you're totally right that actually the claim we should not tolerate super riches or we should use their money to solve the problems comes at the end of the reasoning. But I think you're right to stress that the question about tackling poverty, addressing injustices, and what this implies to no longer tolerating this degree of inequality is only part of a much bigger story. And I'm now going to use a word that we haven't used yet, and I know it's deeply contested, but the present model we have is what people call neoliberalism, and we just need an alternative for neoliberalism, and that requires an idea of the good life, a worked out account of what social justice requires. From that, you need to think about what an economy you need, and then you come to the measure. So it's a big, big project.
I agree.
We already have a proposal, civil economy.
Somebody who was.
May I?
Please.
Marcelo, one thing for Jeff is also in Italy, the secretary of the Democrat Party made the proposal for the inheritance law for very rich people. And what was incredible is that the large majority of people who would have been benefit from that was against that. So the problem is that there is a manipulation also of the public opinion, which makes this more problematic. One issue about anthropology. I think that the right way to, that's what the civil economy says, the right way to reconcile the Christian anthropology with the utilitarianism is to look at the concept of generativity. Generativity means on empirical data that people of life is richer, people are happy if they are creative and they have a higher impact on other people. This is based on data. The real problem is that generativity is an arduous good, no? As you say in theology. It's tiresome. Happiness is tiresome. It requires effort and virtue. And the concept we have of freedom today, which is just freedom of doing whatever you want, it does not help the creation of virtue, because freedom is also freedom from and freedom for. So I think that's the real obstacle is that the concept is there, but it's difficult to achieve. The last point I want to make, we should pay attention when we talk about merit. But of course, Rocco knows that, because if you look at James Buchanan, he says James Buchanan is not a Marxist. He says there are 4 things that can contribute to our outcomes: effort, money, luck, and talent. And the only thing that we deserve is effort. Okay, so I think when we discuss about merit in the society, we must counteract the idea of responsibility, the logic of Spider-Man. You know what Spider-Man says, no? When you have great power, you need great responsibility. That's the merit. You know, you have power, you do a lot for your society. You are generative. Because otherwise we go to the idea that poor have to be blamed. It's easy, eh? When you put the merit in the wrong way, you end up with poor have to be blamed.
Rocco.
The forefathers of the civil economy used in their books to write the share of God, because what I did in part was my merit, in part was, some would say luck. They prefer to say the providence of God, and that was for the poor.
Sooner or later, we should start asking ourselves, how was it possible that we reached in the last few decades the situation which has been described this morning and in the afternoon concerning the topic of poverty and inequality? Because of course, the description are rich enough to let us understand that we are facing an extraordinary phenomenon. Now, to answer that, one dimension of the possible debates is the following. In 1921, the philosopher Walter Benjamin published an important book, which in those days was just put aside. The title of the book, as Rocco knows very well, being himself a philosopher, is Capitalism as Religion. And in that book, Benjamin said, capitalism is not an economic system, as many people believed, and many schools of economic thought made out, but it's a religion, of course, immanentistic religion, non-transcendental, but it's a religion. And he draws all the feature of making equivalence between a proper religion and capitalism. And he concluded this situation cannot go forever. And he added one remark. It is a major responsibility of the 3 religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Muslim, the so-called religions of the book, that are having surrendered to that description. Instead of attacking on theological grounds that position, they simply accepted the role for themselves of putting some remedies, some local, as we were talking this morning, etc. It seems to me that there is a point in this argument that today, what Marcelo, Chancellor, said in many different ways, in my opinion, is relevant. Because if we forget to take into the picture the theological dimension, or if you want, the religious dimension, we run the risk of continuing describing what is wrong without taking a position. Because it is useless to say to those who support the present status what we were talking about, because they will say, after all, we are efficient. Because after all, and that is true, the global GDP is increasing year after year. So since for us efficiency is the creed, and that is a religious creed, so you cannot attack them on that basis. You have to argue that their assumption does not guarantee them to provoke what they are actually doing on the political side. And that is why in chapter 5 of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis titled For a Better Politics. That is the first time that in the encyclical appears a whole chapter dedicated to politics. He says the real point is that today politics has to free itself from the economic side, because our politicians, they believe to be free, but they are servants. They are servants. I mean, Jeff has written many things in the past few years on that. You can produce facts. They are servants because the power of plutocracy, of blackmailing is such that they are committed to do, they simply adjust a bit, one in one way or the other, etc. So perhaps that is an important to conclude message. We have to start from the basics. When we say theology, we also mean, of course, a philosophy. Otherwise, there is no way, in my opinion, to cope with the situation.
I can add something very interesting. We have in the Academy of Sciences, Professor Coppens, this is a very famous archaeologist, that discovered Lucy, this famous lady that have 3,200,000 years ago. And he say that just, we have a meeting about this, the religion in the early human being. And he said that for the science that they do, an instrument, that have a religion and they pray. So the people really specialists in these things not believe in this mythology evolutionistic that the economists use to convince the people. No, it's completely different thing. From the beginning, the human being was different because it's a religious being. So, for example, and this is the thesis that is supported by the more important scholars for the anthropology. So we can say that it's completely contrary with the fantastic idea of evolution that the economists want to, that we believe that we are matter and not more matter. So this is the country of the history, the country of the civilization, the country of religion, but they continue to say this. So please react about this.
First, let me call on Claude.
No.
Nancy had her hand raised and Sebastian does.
Yeah, please, can you call on them? I can't see who it is.
Can I ask? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
Okay, I have a question for Jeffrey and for anyone here. At what extent, Jeffrey, do you think that the current multilateral organizations and main foundations, philanthropic foundations, are colonized by the conception of humanity proposed by plutocracy? And what are our chances to influence it, and by what ways?
The multilateral institutions, you're asking?
Yes.
Yes. I think what is, I think the very important point about the multilateral system is that it has had two parts to it. One is a true multilateralism in which different countries, different parts of the world have their voice and their role. And the second has been a US-led system that is breaking down right now. But from 1945 to the 1990s, the US really was the underpinning of much of certainly the financial world, the economic world, and the military alliances. And so there are two kinds of multilateralisms. There is the UN Charter multilateralism, and there is the alliance multilateralisms. If you look interestingly at the speeches this past week at the General Assembly, only there were 3 countries in the first day out of 36 that used the word alliance. I had Julie count them. Those 3 were the United States, because Joe Biden said alliance at least a dozen times. Palau used the word once, and Poland used the word once. Somebody else used the word, but in a technical context. The US vision is a US-led multilateralism. This is obviously incompatible with a true multilateralism, but it works from a financial and military point of view. Financially, it has worked because if you want to make an international payment, by and large, you must do it in dollars or in a bank that uses dollars, and therefore you have control over international payments. So the US can close down economies, which it has done with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Iran, with North Korea, and so on. That is a financial tool that's very powerful. Also, the US is the nuclear umbrella for Japan, for Korea, for other countries. But this system is coming to a logical end right now because of the rise of China and because of the more disseminated technological and economic power in the world. But we're in a period of profound uncertainty and flux, a dangerous period, because will this be a new Cold War, a new balance of power? Will it be multilateralism under global norms? All of them are possible outcomes. The US is trying to make a new Cold War. This is the deliberate, designed strategy of the United States, is a US, European, East Asian alliance against China. That is the idea. Well, welcome to Armageddon. This is a nearly insane point of view by very dangerous and very ignorant people who like their plutocracy and don't want to see it shared with others. So this is what multilateralism is right now. In the meantime, the UN system by nature is of the first kind, because in a UN organization, there are people from 100 countries. The rules are oriented towards the UN Charter. You don't have an ethos of US-led, except in the IMF and the World Bank. Not even quite in the IMF perhaps anymore, but certainly the World Bank is owned and operated by the United States. But other than that, the New York-based institutions and WHO and others are facing the Lumumba problem, if I can put it that way. If you're not sufficiently against China, you are our enemy, and we will punish you. And so in the American mentality, the line that was famously used, if you're not with us, you're against us, is an American elite point of view. And this is the great tension of the international system now. And the US thinks in the end, that because Europe depends on the US for the nuclear umbrella, in the end, the US will create a new alliance. That's what Biden means when he says the US is back. But unfortunately for Biden, the US may be collapsing internally faster than he can make a new alliance. So the drama also is the sad reality of the state of affairs of the United States internally, because there is no governing coalition inside the United States that can actually lead anything, even inside the US. And so in this sense, the US is a semi-failed state, unfortunately, the richest in history that is a semi-failed state, but we're moving closely towards that. And on the international side, it's quite dangerous. I don't know whether we're in the age of geriatrics as we were with the Brezhnev era, because our politics is really at an end in the United States the way it is right now. It is not normal coalitions and clarity and vision and ability to do something. We feel like we're at the end of a period. And I hope I did not speak out of turn too bluntly, but when you are living in the United States right now, you're living in an absolutely peculiar, unstable, dangerous environment with politics that does not behave according to basic decency or transparency. And this is really our reality with 6,000 nuclear warheads. That's the problem. Sorry.
Back to Nansuk before moving on, if she still wants to contribute.
Please.
All right, moving on.
She wrote in the chat that she can ask about interventions tomorrow.
Okay. Ricardo?
Yes, connecting to your last words, how long will it take for a change of paradigm?
I don't know any way to, I really don't know any way to predict this.
But it's a way to go.
You know, I feel it's a very open situation. On the one hand, the United States is changing rapidly and in perhaps a very desirable way. It's changing demographically, it's changing in social ideas. The young generation is very different from the older generation. So that is a lot of promise. And I think I would really emphasize we should focus a lot of our discussion and attention on young people, period. There's no doubt they will make the future. And so helping young people make the future is the most important thing we can do, honestly. It's really true. It's not a cliche. It's the most important thing we can do. So on the one side, I see lots of positive dimensions, but on the other hand, dangerous situations don't necessarily get better. They can get worse. And the United States is in that situation. We have had minority rule by violence in the United States for much of American history. And that is the intention of definitely of a significant part of the United States, which is to govern by non-democratic, illegitimate means based on power and money. And we're very close to that. So it's hard to predict what the outcome will be. If I were sure that we're going to have honest voting with voter participation and no nuclear war in between, we'll get out of this in 10 to 20 to 30 years. I'm worried about the disasters in between, frankly.
And Jeff, you know, when you say that, you were just a minute ago, you said, forgive me for being blunt, but what is it, Orwell that says, telling the truth in a time of deceit is revolutionary itself? Maybe. It might be that the only hope for getting out of this is for the church and people of faith to reclaim their prophetic voice.
Yes.
To then have economists who are true moral economists and not just the apologists for the religion of capitalism. Young people who are deeply religious but fear the structure. Because in the movement I'll talk some about tomorrow, young people are flocking to the Poor People's Campaign tomorrow. And then one other piece that we have to think about in theology, bibliology, philosophy, is this concept of every now and then you come to these moments when the stones that the builders reject become God's instrument.
We need to pray.
Yeah, at the valley of dry bones.
Not only to speak.
You know, the valley of dry bones. That's who they, you know, if you go to, I mentioned Ezekiel earlier, and Ezekiel was calling the people wolves. God then asked him, can I find anybody that would stand in the gap to stop it? And then the text says he could find nobody. And for 15 chapters, nobody was standing in the gap. Where did God send Ezekiel to find the ones that would close the gap? He found them in the valley of dry bones, rejected, the poor. They became the instrument of God. And I think that when I sit here today, this kind of honesty is so important, but it might also mean if there is a way out, it's only going to come when we have this kind of prophetic economic leadership driven by youthful vigor, but also by the very people who are being robbed, the very people are being destroyed. There are these moments in the kairos, not the chronos, but there are these moments in the kairos where the very people we think we're caring about are the very people that can care for us, that can break the spell, right? And so what I'm looking at in this demographics is, yes, the demographics are shifting in race, but even in America, and the reason we say about America is it affects so much other negative around the world, is that for the first time in history, what, 30% of the electorate is now poor and low wealth. And the number of poor and low wealth not engaged for anybody to have the power. And when I go among them, whether it's in the Tenderloin in San Francisco or Appalachia in West Virginia or Alabama, one of the things they say is the reason we have not been moved because nobody calls our name. Mm-hmm. And we found that we can't ask them to vote. That's the wrong thing. They don't want to hear that. Most of them want to hear something that's moral, something of faith, something that's about humanity, something that's bigger than even them getting a better house, but them having a better world that they can gravitate to and fight for. So it may be that the very thing that the Pope has lifted and the very people that the Holy Father has lifted is also his preaching in the valley of dry bones. And calling those, and maybe the rattling is beginning right here in this conference and in other places.
I think everyone knows Reverend Barber's leading the only grassroots campaign in the United States against poverty, and with an amazing response. But it's such hard work, and there's so many perversities in it. And one of them, I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but in this fight for a modest package, as I said, of social support, Biden cannot get his own party on side. And one of the main obstacles is the senator of West Virginia, as people have been reading about, Senator Manchin, who represents the poorest state in the country and yet is against the package of help. And that is how deeply deranged
and who claims to be Catholic.
And who claims to be Catholic. That's a good idea too. That gives some thoughts.
Hey, Glenn. Right, I mean, really, but the reason he does it is because those who are arguing for the change, I blame us somewhat more than him, because the very ones that are talking about these, like the president, he won't go to West Virginia. He won't talk to those white women in Appalachia who sell tacos.
Why?
I told you what they told me. They said to us, we offered to bring a demographically diverse group of poor people to the White House to meet with the president. We wanted to bring you and some other economists and some moral leaders, and then leave that meeting and go to the mic. And we were told, we're scared you might bring the wrong poor and low wealth people.
No.
Who were the wrong ones?
I don't know. That's what I'm saying. But they said that they're the
White
wrong
House.
ones.
Wrong poor people.
That might get before the camera and say the wrong. And we were going to bring folk from West Virginia. We were going to bring these white moms who sell tacos on Tuesday so they can pay for other one another's menstrual supplies. I don't say that disrespect. That's what they told me to always say. And they literally have said for 5 months, we have begged the American president, who actually said he wanted to help the campaign, who actually said, we have begged him, but is that religion of capitalism? What he said when he was running and what's in that, and his handlers have done everything they can to resist having, we were gonna bring Jews, Muslims, Christians, and then impacted persons. And they said we might bring the wrong people.
I think this comes back to your really, I thought, interesting point.
Could you speak up?
Oh, sorry. I think
Thank
this
you.
comes back to your really interesting point about the conflation of race and poverty in America, which both statistics are right. People who are Black are more likely to be in poverty statistically than people who are white in the US and other places. But it's also true that
Abigail, speak up.
Sorry.
And you speak very fast.
I do. I know, especially when I'm thinking hard. So right. So both statistics are right that there are people who are Black in America are more likely to be in poverty than people who are white. But it's also true that there are more white Americans in poverty than people who are Black. My own experience working with people who are focused on poverty and development in universities is that they tend to live in urban centers, and then many of them on the coasts. And their view of poverty is actually very sort of, I think, relatively racially homogenous. They don't think about Appalachia at all when they're thinking about poverty. It's my experience with scholars who study poverty and development, and certainly in my discipline of psychology. And my own experience, my husband used to work for Biden when he was in the last administration and worked on the Hill as well. So I'm familiar with the kinds of people who tend to be the handlers, and they tend to also be overwhelmingly very educated, very young people from very progressive urban areas that I think have a little bit of a myopic view of poverty. And the wrong person.
One of them is Black.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Real crazy.
But real educated, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's
and from very, and we're all so constrained by our social networks. I think this is where, the social psychology comes in. Americans as a rule are not ungenerous people. We're statistically speaking, it's on a personal level, Americans are very generous, but the distortions in our politics are so, and this is one of the things I think is really interesting about this group, is how it is so important to focus on the young, but this is a really old group. If we were bringing in a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds, we have two who I'm sure can attest to this, they would not be referring to, just for example, the Wall Street Journal as an example of, the word on the street. The average Wall Street Journal reader, I just looked up, has $1.4 million in wealth. And, the 20 and 30-year-olds are not reading the Wall Street Journal. Unfortunately, they're, on TikTok, which is its own problem. And I think the dynamics that lead to these really highly polarized, sclerotic political processes that don't remotely reflect what the average American voter wants, right? If we actually had policies that reflect what the average person wants, things would be looking pretty good in a lot of ways. 2/3 of Americans support universal health care now. It's an enormous number, so much different than it used to be. But I think, unfortunately, these hyper-polarized homogenous networks of people that surrounding politicians who are, I think, overall well-meaning, lead to massive distortions in the way that we think about giant social systems, including I think the unfortunate conflation of race and poverty that can lead people to think that poverty is a problem of those people, And I think that happens for social issue after social issue after social issue. Because America is such a diverse society, it's both our strength and our weakness. There are very few, strong democracies. I was looking this up earlier too. Ethnic homogeneity and strong democracies are very highly correlated around the world. We're in a tough situation, and we have to do better at making people perceive the problems of each one of us as all of our problems. And talking about the problems of atomized groups is the best, again, from a psychological perspective, is the best way to reduce empathy for people who are suffering. They're a member of that group. Not only are they not like you, so it's harder to empathize with people who are different from yourself, but they're a member of a group, and you can't empathize with a group. A group is an abstraction. If you want to empathize with a person, it has to be a person with a mind and feelings. And when we start atomizing people and referring to, to groups in this group and that group, it really suppresses empathy and compassion terribly. Sorry, I've talked too long.
Thank you, Claude.
I want to build on what you just said, Abigail, because if we start thinking of solutions and hope, those of us who live in New York City, many of us feel that we have hope based on what we saw during the primaries for the new mayoral campaign on the Democratic side, because the next likely mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, really spoke from the heart and built a multiracial coalition of working class New Yorkers by telling people how he had been incarcerated as a 15-year-old, how he had worked as a dishwasher in New York City, how he had basically been homeless in New York City, and he managed to rise to the top of New York City politics. And I think that the reason he was able to do that and beat all these other super educated people is because he was able to also rally young people who don't read the Wall Street Journal and who wanted somebody who they could relate to. And that's why I want to talk about the key word here, which is the word empathy, which is often missing in a lot of the academic political discourse that we hear, because it's the ivory tower over everybody else's opinion. And I think that when I see the rise of a candidate like Eric Adams, it gives me hope for potential social transformation in America, even.
Great.
In a city like New York, which is built on major stratification.